Hey there guys, welcome. This is something I've been wanting to make, so I've been, playing quite a bit so I can try and come up with it. This is Dark Souls 2 Scholar of the First Sin. So, a lot of people are confused on exactly what this is, and are unsure of what has changed and if it's worth their money and or time. So I wanted to kind of make a bit of something to show people what it is, I guess, and to talk about, well, to give you a good impression of, let you decide yourself, if it's worth it for you. So, I wanted to kind of show off what's changed. First of all, I want to say that graphical improvements are a little bit tough to show off in a YouTube video, because YouTube compresses videos when they're uploaded, so there's artifacting and stuff like that, so things like texture quality, lighting effects, and things are not as easy to show off in a purely video form. You want, like, high-quality, lossless screenshots for stuff like that, generally speaking, so I'm only going to be able to talk a little bit about that during the video, but I will mention it, of course. I'll talk about that first. And then I'm going to talk about the three different groups of people, basically, that could possibly buy this, and then try and give you some information to let you decide if you think it's worth it for you. So, here we go. Welcome to Dark Souls 2 once again. This is a game that I absolutely love and a series that I adore. I have loved all three of them. I think that they're fantastic games, and I like them all pretty much equally, actually. I have enjoyed Demon's Souls since its Chinese release, and really I've just been enjoying everything about this series. I'm a massive lore nerd, so I love to figure out the story, or try to figure out the story. And there are just tons and tons of things about these games that I adore. So, first of all, let's talk about one of the larger marketed improvements that's not that large, which is the graphical improvement. So Scholars of the First Sin runs on DirectX 11, whereas the original Dark Souls 2 ran off of DirectX 9. So for the DirectX 11 version, you have a couple of extra effects. You have slightly improved lighting and shadows, and improved texture quality. There seems to be a bit of maybe tessellation on the textures and things here and there, which means that they have a bit more depth to them. For instance, it's not very easy to notice on something like this wall. Yes, we're going to lick some walls. It doesn't look that great. But in certain areas of the game, you'll notice that there's a bit more detail to the textures. A lot of structural textures, things like walls and things, have a bit more depth to them. You'll see things like these bricks, for instance, which I can't show you too well because, again, YouTube video, but textures like this, stone, brick, stuff like that across the game, tend to have a bit more depth. You can see the grout lines, I guess you could say, a bit better. You can see little chips and stuff taken off of them. It's a very subtle improvement that's not that noticeable, and it's not really that big of a deal. But the bigger improvements are in the lighting. The lighting is still not up to the level of the E3 lighting that we were shown, but it is better than the DX9 version. There's a bit more depth to the shadows, some ambient occlusion going on, and there's also some areas actually get very, very dark now, to the point where you actually need a torch. The darkness can get quite oppressive in some areas and make you really need to take your time a bit more and hold your torch out, which I don't mind. I like that quite a bit. But overall, the lighting is just it's got a bit more of a kind of orangey glow to it, you might notice in Majula, and the lighting around all of the different areas has been improved slightly, but again, I have to emphasize that it's a slight improvement, and it's not this massive major thing like we saw in the E3 footage. Finally, the texture quality improvements most noticeable are on your equipment. So, on the equipment of other characters and yourself, their clothing, their weapons, their gear looks a bit better. This is the one that's the most noticeable, probably not in a YouTube video very well, but your shields, your armor, your weapons, they all have a bit more depth to them. The textures look a bit better. The lighting across them, like metal surfaces, sheens from fire and stuff like that, as you can see on my shield here, it all looks a little bit better. Again, though, I have to say that even though the improvement in textures that have been sort of cleaned up for your equipment are the most noticeable, it's still not a huge improvement. So if you're looking for a massive graphical improvement, Scholars of the First Sin doesn't really deliver that. But most people will tell you that if you're playing the Souls games for graphical quality, you're probably doing it wrong. Nevertheless, it is nice to have some better looking stuff, even if it's a bit subtle, so the main selling point of this, I guess, almost remastered version is definitely not its visual improvement. So, we're going to go to an area, we're going to go to the forest really quick so I can show you something. Actually, we're going to go... let's go here. So, let's see here. The three groups of people that are generally going to be buying something like this. You have the people that have never played Dark Souls 2 before and don't own it. You have the people that own Dark Souls 2 but never played any of the DLC. They don't own any of them. And then you have the people that own everything. They own DS2 and all 3 DLC. So those are the 3 main people I'm going to be focusing on right now. If you're one of those groups, hopefully that covers most of everyone, then hopefully this video will be a bit useful to you. So, personally, for disclosure, I happen to be in the second group. I love Dark Souls 2, but I never played the DLC. I didn't own any of them. Hey, why don't you come up here? Hey, you wanna get up here? I know you do. Hey, what's up? And you're dead. So, if you've never played Dark Souls 2 before, if you don't own it, but are interested in it, this is the definitive version. And if you're going to get any version of Dark Souls, this is the one to get. Dark Souls 2, that is. That is because it... Hey, you fell. It includes several little upgrades, and it is the best looking of them, and it includes all of the DLC for a nice price of $50. $50 is not too bad, considering technically it's about $90 if you were to buy this on release and all the DLC. So $50 for everything is a pretty acceptable price if you've never... Dang it. If you've never played any of them but are interested in them. So if that's the case, I would not hesitate to recommend this version whatsoever to you. Scholars of the First Sin is the definitive Dark Souls 2 version. It includes the original game and the DLCs, all of them. The DLCs are also integrated into the game a bit better, which is something I'll talk about when we get to the what all the changes are part of the video. If you are like me, and like Dark Souls 2 but never owned any of the DLC, this is a good deal. If you liked Dark Souls 2, that is, if you want to play more of it, then this is a good deal, because if you already owned the game, you get this for $30 instead of $50. And since $30 is the price of getting all of the DLC anyway, you could say that you're basically paying the same as you would to just get all the DLC on the version you already own, but you're also getting more. But something to bear in mind, the servers are separate, so people that own the DX9 version and people that own the DX11 version don't play on the same servers, so you can't co-op together. And you have to start a new save. Your saves from the original Dark Souls 2 are not compatible. That is pretty much the only negative, I would say. If you liked it and want to play more, then I could recommend it in that case as well. I was very happy to pay $30 for it because I was going to buy the DLC anyway, but I decided to wait for this version to come out, saw that it was pretty much improved, and then paid the exact same price to get even more content. So that's something. If you already own the game and all of the DLCs, though, this is where things get a bit murky. People are rating my messages? Got a couple of messages being rated. Interesting. So that's a bit of a harder sell, because you're paying $30 in that case for a much smaller bit of improvements, much more incremental change. And that's what this video is kind of for, to show you what all has changed. That's going to be up to you, really, because obviously it's not nearly as good of a deal to pay $30 for a much smaller set of improvements if you already own everything. That's definitely going to have to be your call. If you really, really like Dark Souls 2, and you want more of it, I'd say that enough has changed in this version to give you more enjoyable adventures. Plus the fact that you have to start over so you can experience everything from the beginning again. But if you're kind of unsure, it definitely isn't as good of a deal as the other two groups of people. So I guess let's show you what all has changed. So one of the biggest, most obvious differences is the new enemy placement. So all of the areas have new placements and varieties of enemies in them. So I wanted to show you this for a reason. This was one of the things that people did not like about the forest in the first Dark Souls 2. When you climb up this ladder here, from the other bonfire, of course, you're surrounded by a bunch of these soldiers. There are about 5 of them, if I remember correctly. You climb up this ladder, and there are about 5 soldiers around here that instantly jump on you. What they've done with this area is they've actually increased the number of enemies in a lot of the areas. However, they have made them a bit different to encounter. In this case, all of the hollows are actually on the ground. Instead of all of them jumping at you at once when you climb this ladder, now they're all basically asleep, and if you're careful enough, you can awaken one of them at a time to fight them. So what they've actually done with this area is, even though they have increased the number of enemies up here, they have made them easier to actually strategically encounter, I would say. Instead of all rushing at you at once, now you can choose your fight. And that's something that you see in a lot of the area's enemy placements now. The placements are less frustrating. Even though that a lot of enemies actually have more enemies, they are now placed in such a way to make it to where you can strategically choose your encounters a bit easier. They don't all rush at you at once, which was one of the larger complaints I heard about Dark Souls 2, was that there are just too many enemies. If I wanted to be a moron and just run through this area without paying attention, I'm gonna aggro just a ton of these guys. But if I was careful, I wouldn't have to worry about that. Oops, that was dumb. So I do like that change. I like that change quite a bit. It's kind of nice to actually fight more enemies, because you actually level up a bit faster in this version because there's just more souls to have. But all of the enemy placements have been switched around in a lot of places to make the encounters a bit different. So this is one of those examples. I might as well show you this as well while I'm here. If we go down this ladder, you'll see that there are also a few more enemies in this river area. But again, a lot of them have their own little patrol areas that are a bit different from the original variants. So that more or less what you're seeing is basically a game that has more enemies to fight, but allows you to pick your fights easier, which is a change that I appreciate. Because like I said, that was one of the biggest complaints of the first Dark Souls 2 experience for people, was that there are just so many enemies that you get swamped too easily. Now, a lot of areas have placements that really emphasize the careful strategy that Demon Souls and Dark Souls 1 were known for. You don't run through like a moron, you slowly walk around until you get used to the area. And this game has definitely went back to that. Now, as you can see, this guy's new. He wasn't here before. So that's something to consider. There's now an ogre here, but he will not aggro you if you're just walking along. This is another difference in a lot of the enemy placements, is that their aggro ranges make it to where they're often kind of in optional areas. Like that particular ogre, I could walk down and fight all these guys and not worry about the ogre. I could then wait it out, wait for him to go up there, and then run across to that bonfire without aggroing him. And so what you're basically seeing is a large number of changes in enemy placement that emphasize the original Dark Souls and Demon Souls philosophy more than what Dark Souls 2 had, which is walk around a bit more slowly, sometimes with your shield up, and get used to the areas you're exploring before you start kind of running through them like crazy. Because if you do that, you're going to die. And if you are a bit more careful, if you pay more attention to your surroundings while you're fighting, then you can much more carefully pick your battles. So that is probably the biggest difference. I know that the graphical improvements are kind of the ones that are hyped up the most, but those aren't really that noticeable. The bigger improvements are actually involving enemy placement. There are a lot of differences, so I'm going to show you some of the differences in the castle as well. Boop. If I were to climb up this ladder, you'll see that these two enemies in this room are now one enemy. That turns to stone and unpetrifies when you start to go down the ladder, to chase you down the ladder. Which means that now, instead of being swamped by those two enemies when you walk in this room, you're going to have one follow you down the ladder, and if you're not paying attention, stab you in the back with their flamberge. That didn't sound good. Another one of the differences is a lot of the enemies in the castle area, for instance, are turned to stone. And you have to be wary of which ones are going to awaken when you come close to them, which, again, emphasizes the older Souls game strategy of slowly and carefully approaching your enemies until you kind of can formulate a good strategy, more or less not knowing exactly what you're in for. You don't see the groups of enemies from far away. Oftentimes, you just have to slowly approach until you get a grasp of the area, and then you can run around it more quickly once you've gotten used to it. So, here's an example. That particular one, now he's awakened. So, what this actually does to the castle areas, that was dumb, is make them a bit less, I guess, tedious to go through, because there are actually fewer packs of enemies and more singular encounters that you have to pay attention to. Oh, that was dumb. Like I failed to do there. I should have been a bit more careful, knowing that that particular knight will awaken if I get close to him, and not gotten close to him. But I did. So, again, this emphasizes the, hey, be careful, watch where you're walking kind of strategy that these games were known for a long time. Which I like, because that's something I definitely loved about the first two games that was not absent from Dark Souls 2, I would say, but a bit less important. Oftentimes you would just walk into an area and no matter how you approached it, you would be faced with a large pack of enemies. Now, there are large packs of enemies, sometimes larger packs. But they are more manageable because you can pick your battles easier. So the new enemy placement is a very big deal. It actually drastically changes some of the areas. For instance, as you can see, this hallway is quite a bit different than it used to be. It actually makes some areas feel almost entirely different from what they were before. For instance, places like No Man's Wharf and Huntsman's Copse feel like almost entirely new areas. They feel so different that it's basically a new experience. Even if you were used to how the originals felt, you're actually going to get a pretty new experience this time around, because there are just so few similarities, I guess you could say. All of the enemy placements are completely new, and sometimes you'll find areas that just have different enemies altogether, or are missing some enemies you remember. And this, I wanted to show you this area because it shows off something that's, again, kind of new to this version. In the original Dark Souls 2, you were often forced to pretty much kill almost every enemy because you would get aggroed by large packs. However, now, there are, more often than not, choices of what you can fight, by which I mean there are a lot of enemies in a lot of the zones that you don't have to fight if you don't want to go in a particular direction at that time. In the original Dark Souls, pretty much going up here, you would get attacked by any of the enemies in the area. Now, however, because these guys are frozen in stone, if you want to explore and fight them, you can. But if you just want to walk into the castle, you don't actually have to. So if I go over here to get this chest, suddenly this guy awakens. This is a bit of a philosophy that, of course, the original Dark Souls and Demon Souls were known for, that wasn't as prevalent in the second game. That oftentimes you would be forced to fight every enemy in an area that you approached, instead of being able to kind of weave your way around and avoid some of them, unless of course you just wanted to dash past them all, which is something that you've always been able to do. Also, a lot of areas have become less obnoxious. Like, weren't there 4 of those Primal Knights, those Mastodon guys? Oh shoot, Forlorn invades here? Uh-oh. I didn't know that. Oh, it's the Scythe one. Okay, this could be a problem. Alright, more about this in a second, but as I was saying, there's a bit of a difference. A lot of the areas have become just straight up less frustrating. Some of the more frustrating elements have been taken out of them. By which I mean, think about having to fight, weren't there those 4 of those Primal Knights, the Mastodon guys up here? Now there are only 2, which means this area is, you know, still difficult, but less frustrating. A lot of the difficulty is still preserved. The game is definitely, in my opinion, it's actually harder than the original Dark Souls 2, but it's a bit less cheap feeling in certain areas and a bit less frustrating in general. And I really shouldn't be blocking that close up because he's got a scythe and it hurts me anyway. A lot of the... damn it. A lot of the new enemy placements show that there are essentially completely changed strategies for how you're going to need to approach an area. For instance, like I mentioned, No Man's Wharf is actually a lot different. Damn. I'm screwing this up pretty bad. No! And some of the things that you remember being able to do, okay, you're not going to be able to do anymore. Some of the things you may have remembered that you had to do in a certain area, the kind of procedural, alright, I go from the bonfire, I go here, I fight this pack, I go and fight this pack, and then I make it to the next bonfire. Those kind of memories of how you come across and fight an area, those might not serve you as well anymore, because a lot of these strategies are going to be changed up. So, what else has changed? Well, that guy is new, Forlorn. The Forlorn are these very cool invaders that will randomly invade you in certain areas. Sometimes they'll appear and sometimes they won't. They are quite difficult to fight sometimes. That guy I was able to handle pretty well, but expect the first couple of times you find those guys to be pounded into the ground by them if you're not prepared. The Forlorn are difficult new invaders that show up randomly in specific areas of the game, and if you're able to fight them, Strayed, back in the Lost Bastille, will sell you Forlorn equipment for each one you're able to defeat, which is very cool, including their weapons and armor, which looks awesome, by the way. There are also many more NPCs to summon if you're playing offline or if you're playing online but want to, you know, enhance your experience by summoning a couple of NPCs as well. There are many more of them now, including some that aren't just for bosses but are in the middle of levels to help you with the level itself, which is cool. Also, there are a lot more invaders that will attack you, a lot more NPC, non-player invaders. Besides the Forlorn, there are many. In Iron Keep, for instance, there are 2 separate ones that will actually invade you at the very beginning. Iron Keep is a bit difficult now, because the Elon Knights have switched places somewhat, but are, let's just say, they can see you from a lot farther away now. The boss fights remain pretty much the same now, as far as I can tell, that the bosses are pretty much identical to what they've always been, but a lot of the levels and NPCs that you can have help you with the levels and the bosses have been completely changed around. Another thing that's changed a lot is, besides the new invaders, which there are a lot of, by the way, is loot. So there are a couple of new items in the game. Besides, of course, some of the Forlorn equipment, there's some new equipment to find, no spoilers. And a lot of the loot that you may have been familiar with has been moved around. For instance, the Dull Ember, which you use to get the McDuff, that's his name. The blacksmith that you can infuse your weapons and armors with, or shields. It's normally in the Iron Keep. You have to make it all the way through to the Iron Keep in order to unlock McDuff for infusing your stuff for you. Now, the Dull Ember is actually right at the beginning of the Lost Bastille in the Tower Apart bonfire, the one that you go to from the forest after you kill the pursuer and have the giant crow move you around. Oh dear. I heard they changed this a lot, but even though it looks more difficult, I heard they removed a lot of the annoyances of these stone spear guys and made them less obnoxious to fight. Oh god. One thing also to say, the Bastille Key is in a completely different area. The Bastille Key used to be after Belfry Luna, you had to go through Belfry Luna in order to actually find the key. Now, it's actually in a spot where a human effigy used to be, at the edge of one of the areas. So you can actually find the Bastille key a lot easier now, which is interesting. So basically what the general, I guess if I was to come up with... Oops. That was dumb of me. If I was to come up with a general, this is what they've changed for this version in its entirety, more or less, they've made a lot of the areas of the game less frustrating while still preserving the difficulty. A huge number of... Are you gonna come to life and try and kill me? A huge number of the areas have so many differences now that they feel completely different, and that's something I very much approve of. So hopefully, what I've talked about and what I've shown you, you can decide whether or not this version is for... Don't you come to life. Is for you. Ooh, the frozen flower! That's another thing to talk about. The DLC areas now, originally because the DLC was, well, it was DLC, the keys to the areas were added to your inventory upon buying the DLC. However, now, since this is basically like a Game of the Year edition, the DLC is integrated a bit differently, meaning essentially you will find areas that that the keys for the DLC are actually in, and you have to find the keys before you can access the DLC. Which helps for a couple of things, including knowing when you should actually go to the areas. So, that's pretty much what I've got to say. I'm loving it, but I know that it's not the greatest deal for some people. And hopefully this has given you enough of a what's different to let you decide for yourself whether or not it's worth it for you. Personally, I'm enjoying the hell out of it, but I love Dark Souls 2 in the first place, and I'm very willing to put up with starting a new save to, you know, change some stuff around, and the game definitely does feel different in a lot of areas. Although the graphical improvements may be subtle, the gameplay differences are anything but. And I really approve of that, so... There you go, folks. I hope this has helped you out a bit. I hope that this is something that you find useful, and I hope that if you have any questions or comments, that you'll leave them so I can answer them. I will answer them. If there's something else you want to see about the game, if there's a specific area you'd like to see, then please tell me, and I will definitely show you. And anything else, just let me know. So, thanks for watching, everyone. I hope this has been a good enough video to help you see what all has changed, and if this version is worth it for you. So this has been Dark Souls 2, Scholar of the First Sin, available now on Steam for $50 if you don't have Dark Souls 2, and for $30 if you already own it. You can still play the original version, by the way. It's a separate install entirely, so even if you buy this version, you can still play the original Dark Souls 2 separately from it, with the original servers and your original saves. So there you go, folks. Thanks very much for watching. The link is in the description below to the Steam store page if you want to check it out. And again, feel free to ask any questions or leave any suggestions for things you want to see about the game if there are any. Thanks very much, and I'll see you guys next time.